The Pontiac Grand Prix is one of the most famous nameplates in the marque's history, and it lasted from the 1962 model year all the way through to 2008, after which Pontiac was effectively defunct. Unfortunately, the Grand Prix ended with a thud, just like the Pontiac Motor Division. But for a number of years over the course of the Grand Prix's lifetime, there were a number of memorable vehicles that were produced. An honorable mention that didn't make the list, because it's a more modern vehicle, is the 1997 Grand Prix that you see here, which really was a vehicle that put Pontiac back on the map in the late 1990s. And personally, I thought that Pontiac was going to enjoy a bit of a second renaissance, but alas, it was not going to come to be. Despite that, the 1997 Grand Prix was a great seller, generally decent vehicles overall with good power, great looks. But for this particular list, we are going to confine ourselves to some of the more classic Grand Prix and talking about what I believe are the top 5 of all time. And you'll have to let me know if you agree or disagree or think that I missed one. So let's get started with number 5. And at number 5, we have the 1988 Grand Prix. Haha, I caught you. That was a joke. The 1988 Grand Prix really didn't make this list. It was an okay car with the strange handles in the B pillar, but not worthy of this list. So let's go on to the real number 5. And at the real number 5, we have the 1963 Grand Prix. Now, 1963 was the first year for the stacked headlamp Pontiacs. The Grand Prix had been introduced in 1962, and it had the quad horizontally oriented headlamps. But for 1963, it was an all-new body style and one that ushered in a new look for Pontiac that would really persist all the way through the 1967 model year, after which in 1968, Pontiac would go away from the stacked headlamp design. But as former designer and recently deceased leader of Pontiac design Bill Porter once said, the 1963 Grand Prix was introduced really as General Motors' response to the 1961 Lincoln Continental. That particular car with extremely clean sides and relatively little chrome, only just tasteful moldings, was an inspiration to designers for the 1963 Grand Prix, as well as cars like the 1965 Cadillac. And you can see a little bit of it here, particularly in that C-pillar, as well as just the clean body side with relatively flat fenders. Of course, there's no fender peak molding here like there is on the 61 Continental. But regardless, Pontiac took that styling in a new direction for the Grand Prix. As I mentioned, the stacked headlamps were introduced. I love how the molding around them just kind of cuts back at an angle over top of the top headlamp. And you have these huge air intakes for the radiator that look like they're for jet engine intakes with a blade in the middle, as well as the turn signals that look would be replicated a little bit on the 1967 Grand Prix that also had those intakes up front, or things that look like intakes, as well as the blade in the middle, although that car did not have stacked headlamps like the 1967 full-size Pontiacs. And as we rotate out back, you really can see that inspirational 1961 Continental here, particularly in the rear quarter, which is relatively flat in side profile and yet canted inward, something that you would see on Pontiacs for years to come. Of course, you have what probably designers wanted to be a full-width tail lamp out back to accentuate the width of the vehicle, but I'm sure that either the engineers or the bean counters said, nope, you can only have lamps over on the side there for the tail lights as well as the turn signals. It's still a great look overall, and of course, you don't have that middle section illuminated when the headlamps aren't on or the tail lamps aren't activated. It would just be dead anyway, so, or with the car off. That's perhaps the reason why it got through. I do like how the bumper continues the rear quarter panel. Notice how it kind of goes upward and continues to form. This car also has Pontiac's beautiful 8-lug drums that would unfortunately go out of style with the drum brakes when those kind of went out in the late 1960s. And I love the concave backlight here on the 63 Grand Prix. Just another beautiful dimension to give this car some gesture, despite its relatively simple styling. I think it's gorgeous. As we turn to the inside, the detailing here on the instrument panel, the door panels, the seats, the center console is second to none, particularly for a 1963 model year car. Pontiac interior designers were putting together fantastic interiors. In fact, Pontiac's chief designer during this time frame, Jack Humbert, had actually come from leading interior studios into leading Pontiac design overall. And it showed not only in his attention to the detail of the exterior, but the attention to detail of the interior. Everything from that beautiful lucite rim on the steering wheel to look at just how gorgeous the door panel is with those ribs up top and then the padded section, the armrests, the beautiful door handle. This car has power windows, pretty well equipped with power windows, AC, automatic transmission, and a radio. But these Grand Prix were just second to none when it came to any car. I don't even think I would pay extra money for the Cadillac, even if I had the money. The car was just so exquisitely detailed. So why is it only number 5 on the list then? Well, the 63 Grand Prix wasn't a great seller, and I think this was really the car that started the Grand Prix gaining some momentum until 1969 when it really just launched. But the other reason is for 1963, there was an unfortunate powertrain element, and that was the roto-hydromatic transmission or Slim Jim automatic that you would get in the short wheelbase Pontiacs as well as the Oldsmobiles. Horrible reliability, horrible shift quality, particularly the 1-2 shift. And, that kind of ruins the driving experience, I would say, for me. You have to put a modern 4L80E or some 4-speed automatic transmission in here and just get rid of that roto-hydromatic, and then you're fine. But that roto-hydromatic is terrible. The 389 cubic inch V8s under hood that were standard were beautiful. It's just unfortunate they were mated to that transmission. So that's why this is in at number 5, and I also think there are some better looking ones, so let's talk about them now. And in at number 4, we have the 1976 Grand Prix. Now, the 1976 Grand Prix was a variant of the Grand Prix that was introduced for the 1973 model year. It was warmed over a little bit by this point, but this particular Grand Prix would last from 1973 to 1977 and be an extremely popular model. In fact, its most popular year was its final year, 1977, which effectively looked like the 76 that you see here, but the grille texture was a little bit different and it was a coarser texture overall with kind of major minor vertical bars as opposed to this relatively thin vertical bar texture that you see here on the 1976 model. That's one of the reasons why the 1976 model made it to this list versus the 1977, but also the styling of this I think is extremely handsome overall. You have that Pontiac Arrowhead hood up front, almost a reverse boat tail car. It looks like, if you flip this around to the rear, it could have been called a boat tail. But it's that Pontiac Arrowhead aligned with the emblem and that beautiful waterfall-style grille that would also be seen on cars that were also popular during this time frame, namely the Oldsmobile Cutlass. But the 76 Grand Prix in particular makes this list because of its dashing looks on the outside and on the inside. The interiors, particularly those with bucket seats like this car, just had a wonderfully handsome theme with this driver-centric kind of instrument panel with the round dials, and here we have the rally gauge package. This one has the luxury 3-spoke steering wheel, but overall it was just a beautifully executed interior with a great theme. Unfortunately, the wood grain was fake by this model year. If you had received or procured a 1973 Grand Am, then you would have real wood on the IP as well as the little center console over there too, but still a tasteful looking interior. And the best part about 1976 was what was under hood. Although it was heavily neutered, you could still get Pontiac's 455 cubic inch V8. This was the last year for the Pontiac 455, and it also had, I believe, the only GM division where they capped off the secondaries a little bit on the Rochester Quadrajet. Actually made it less than the typical Quadrajet for this time frame, 800-ish CFM. I believe they did that for emissions purposes, but in any case, just a little piece of trivia there. But that's why the 76 makes this list, because of the little fine details that are different, like the grille texture that I mentioned, as well as being able to get the 455 under hood. And it certainly should make the list because it was an extremely popular Grand Prix. This body style in 76, 77 was selling 200,000 units a year or north of it. In 77, it was his most popular year. It sold 280,000 units, an extremely popular car, well-liked by the buying public. And now we're in the home stretch of the top 3. Let's begin the top 3 with the 1966 Grand Prix. Now, I mentioned the 1963 Grand Prix was the first of the stacked headlamp Grand Prix, but the 66, I think, is even more beautiful than the 1963, in part because it has more curvature to the body side. That 63 was relatively flat. Remember, the inspiration was the 61 Continental. And here designers are starting to get away from that and into more organic forms. And you can see in the body side, as you compare it to the 1963 Grand Prix, that there just is more roundedness, I guess, overall. And if you also have this Coke bottle shape to the rear quarter, where the rear quarter is flaring outboard as well as upward and downward alongside the rear window graphic there. That was something that was popular in the mid-1960s, late 1960s, some cars into the early 1970s. Some would say that started with the Studebaker Avanti, but in any case, it was pretty dramatic here. And you also had this ribbed chrome trim at the bottom, which I thought was a tasteful accent to an otherwise relatively devoid of chrome body side. And again, you have the Grand Prix hallmark air intakes up front. You still have the turn signals here that are inboard of the headlamps, similar to the 63. So the 66 is kind of a 63 redone with a little bit more curviness to it. And I think that the designers just did a fantastic job. And that beauty really extends to the rear of the car. Take a look here. Is this one of the most gorgeous rear ends of any car ever produced? I certainly think so. Remember that we were talking about how flat the top was of the 1963 Grand Prix rear quarters. Here they have a little bit of a gentle taper. You still have the top of the quarter canting inward, the bumper continuing the shape of the rear quarter, and you have a different variation of that wall-to-wall, I'll call it wannabe tail lamp from the 63 Grand Prix. Here I think even done more tastefully with these ribs that run across the entire car. And I have to say the Coke bottle shape here, that you see the quarter flaring outboard over the rear wheel, which, by the way, is missing a rear fender skirt. Somebody must have taken it off on this car. And this gorgeous arcing backlight. Look at that C-pillar and how it's just got this beautiful arc to it, not only in terms of the backlight and that concave form to the C-pillar, but, oh man, this car is just fantastic looking. And that's the reason why it's so high on this particular list. And just like the 63, the beauty isn't just skin deep. Here, the interior is also phenomenal. This is real walnut trim here, and you still have the lucite wheel, the real walnut trim, and veneer on the steering wheel, the IP, the center console. I love the vacuum gauge on the center console, but the material quality is superb. The detail is superb. I also enjoy those 3 gauges off to the right that are canted toward the driver, and I call these the dual radio Pontiac interiors because the heater control looks like it's a radio. And, it operated interestingly. You turn one of the dials to change the temperature, make it hotter or colder. This is a non-air conditioned car. You can tell because the top pad doesn't have a vent, and there are not lower vents beneath the IP. But that control was rather interesting. It worked just fine. Regardless, the interiors on these were phenomenal. Of course, the engines under hood were also phenomenal. By this point, that awful rotohydromatic was gone. It was just a turbohydromatic transmission that was extremely smooth, extremely reliable, coupled to a 389 cubic inch engine or a 421. You could get up to 376 gross horsepower in your 1966 Grand Prix. So beautiful exterior, gorgeous interior, great powertrains, engines, and transmissions under hood. What's not to like about the 66 Grand Prix? Now let's turn to number 2. At number 2, we have the 1969 Grand Prix. This particular generation Grand Prix would last from the 1969 to 1972 model years, and this was really John DeLorean's car. He spearheaded giving the Grand Prix a more muscular look, this extremely long front end and hood, which is one of the reasons why under hood, when we look at the engine pictures, you'll see the so-called time tunnel under hood with this extremely large radiator shroud to try to help the engine fan actually suck the air through the radiator because it was so far back from the radiator. In any case, the 69 Grand Prix was a rebirth of the model and took the car into a kind of muscular personal luxury coupe orientation. And the car was extremely successful, nearly quadrupling in sales versus the previous model year with the 1968 Grand Prix that only sold about 30,000 units. The 69 Grand Prix sold over 110,000 units. And, well, the 68 was kind of a pudgy-looking car. I actually kind of like the 68, but the 69 was far more muscular and just a masculine-looking vehicle than the 68. And like I said, this was John DeLorean's car. In fact, he was the one who picked the naming scheme to have trims like the J and the SJ mimicking Duesenberg nomenclature. Of course, there was no supercharger underhood for the SJ, but you could get your choice of a Pontiac 400 cubic inch V8 or a 428 cubic inch V8. Both were muscular and powerful choices. If you got the 428, the top engine option, the car would go from 0 to 60 in a little under 7 seconds, which for a big personal luxury coupe was really hauling for the time. The 69 Grand Prix also showed off a few innovations to the buying public, including the windshield-mounted antenna, which some loved and some hated, and these interesting door handles that you kind of pulled on and they would swing outboard as opposed to the more standard door handle. And that would be used on other cars like the 71 Tornado and Riviera as well. Now, out back, the 69 Grand Prix also had a beautiful look to it with a, different C-pillar. Here, a chunkier C-pillar. Didn't have that concave backlight. And you did have this very simple deck lid, but a beautiful rear bumper with the tail lamps set in kind of twin loops there, with the license plate sandwiched in between them. So why didn't this make it higher up on the list? It was a Grand Prix that really set new sales records for the overall nameplate. It's beloved by collectors. Well, I think the interior was a little bit of a letdown. It had a great theme, this very driver-centric cockpit theme to it. But the material quality in 1969 on the Grand Prix, just like other GM cars for the 1969 model year, I don't think was up to the same standards that we saw in the 1963 and 66 models and what you're going to see in the number one model. And that to me is the real letdown of this car, is the interior materials. It's not a bad car. It's got a great engine, great transmission, whether you get the 400 or the 428, get your turbohydromatic transmission. It's a great looking car overall, but I wish they had spent a little bit more money on the interior materials like they did on the earlier versions from the 60s. And then this car, I think, would be perfection. But for those reasons, it's number 2, and we'll now check out number 1. And now we come to number 1, the best Grand Prix of all, at least in my mind, and that is the 1965 Grand Prix. And we're going to show it to you here in Iris Mist, the same color which Chevrolet called Evening Orchid for 1965, a one-year-only color, kind of this purpley silver color, and it's just beautiful and stunning on this car. Again, similar to the 66, dramatic styling, Coke bottle rear styling, but there's some details about the 65 that I just like better, including that wind split molding up front. I like how the Pontiac Arrowhead is shaped a little bit better. And I love the cutouts in the fenders where the fender kind of pulls back away from the nacelles that surround the headlamps. And the nacelles are so beautifully detailed on the 65 as well. And you've got this great little piece of chrome that goes across the bottom of the car that just accentuates the right amount of light that, look at this car. It's just fantastic overall. It's hard to improve upon it. And I like the kind of tri-slot grille up front. You have, again, that air intake, the big scoop intake on either side, but here it's divided into 3. And I think it gives the front end a little bit of dimension. And as we rotate to the rear 3/4 view, we have that gorgeous C-pillar, the concave style backlight and C-pillar that I think just was a beautiful detail from the 63 that they kept refining each year a little bit. Of course, you again have that wall-to-wall ribbed tail lamp theme that I think was perfectly executed here. And one of my favorite details is that Pontiac emblem on the deck lid. It looks like it almost slipped down the deck lid and it made that crease in it as it did so. And it just kind of stopped right before it fell over the edge. I thought that the designers did an amazing job with that. Notice you have kind of that muted W shape to the rear as well. The middle crease is relatively muted here, but you can see the W from plan view or above, similar to other cars in the 1960s, the quarters that cant inward, as we've talked about before on the 63 and 66, and the continuation of the quarter into the bumper. But the 65 from an exterior styling perspective to me is just perfection. It's one of the best looking GM cars ever produced. And again, that beauty continued on the inside. Very similar IP to the 1966 Grand Prix, but those 3 gauges off to the right are here round as opposed to square, and you do have real wood trim like the 1966. Again, just an immensely detailed interior, just as beautiful, if not even more beautiful, arguably, than the Cadillacs of the time period. So Pontiac went all out when it came to these particular vehicles, and it's no wonder why they're cherished by some collectors today. Of course, you had, just like in 1966, the 389 and 421 cubic inch V8s under hood. Although in 1965, you could get a tri-power 389 cubic inch V8 that made 338 horsepower. That was dropped for 1966. So what were you going to do? You had to upgrade to the 421 4-barrel if you wanted that for 1966. Here you had one more engine choice that you could go after. Both cars, the hottest engine was a 376 horsepower 421 cubic inch high output V8. So what do you think? Is my ordering correct? Did I miss one? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.